Welcome, everybody. I don't know all of you, and I don't know exactly all of the projects in the which you're working on and what will come in the future. But the reason I chose this topic is because it gives you, I think, a good overview of the nature of the magmatic arc in the Andes, where we've been working mostly in the northern part of Chile and Argentina, so the Puna Altiplano Plateau. But it also gives you, I think, a good feel for how some of these large projects can integrate geophysics, geology, petrology, and modeling, which I think is something that strategy will do by the time it gets rolling, really. This is a project which, in some ways, was a bit of a startup for strategy, you could say, because we had in the Berlin-Potsdam area from 1993 until 2005 a 12-year DFG program called Collaborative Research Center. And this is a group of people who contributed in the different fields that you see: geophysics, geodynamic modeling, volcanology, geology. You'll notice some of the people who are familiar to you here in strategy and others who went before them. So what I'm going to try to give you is a feeling for how this project approached understanding the geodynamics and the geosystem of the Andes, and hopefully you'll learn also how much information is available from this previous study that you may find useful in your work. You know, I'm sure, but I've repeated it here, that the Central Andes have some really first-order global superlative features. Number one, it's the second highest plateau on the Earth today. Number two, this is no particular order, but it's also what you might call the type locality for the hypothesis that in some collisional origins, the lithosphere gets so thick that it actually will sink into the mantle, and this is a process called crustal or lithospheric delamination. It's also one of the largest provinces of ignimbrites on the Earth today. And last but not least, it's been shown from geophysical studies that there's an active magma body, a magmatic zone under the Central Andes, which is also the largest which people have observed on the Earth. So there's these large features, a plateau, this strange idea of delamination, huge ignimbrite province, and the geophysics is telling us that under the ignimbrite province there's still a zone of partial melting today. And the idea of this talk is to show, or to ask and explore how these features all fit together, if they fit together. First, a small introduction, very simple, about the nature of the magmatic arc and the diversity of volcanic features. First is the classic stratovolcanoes that make up the main arc, the Cordillera, and these you can find all over the world. In the North American Cordillera, they continue. In the Central America, they continue. This is the typical subduction zone stratovolcano. In the Andes, the ages of these starting in about the middle Oligocene and continuing, of course, to the present day with the active volcanoes of the arc. And they're associated geographically with the arc, but as we'll see later, they're also transported farther to the east into the back arc region along some major crustal lineaments. We'll see a map of that in a minute. Then we have these ignimbrites. Here's an example of an eroded plateau of ignimbrite. These are dacitic to rhyolitic, more felsic magmas. More or less the same age distribution, although we have not had any modern eruptions of ignimbrite. There could be one coming, but the most recent tufts that people know are about 1 million years or so old. A patchy distribution. They're not just in the arc, they're not just in the back arc, they sort of spread over both areas. And last, these small cinder cones, lava fields, of basaltic andesite composition, mafic rocks. And these tend to be in the back arc. So you have the large stratovolcanoes in the main arc, you have these ignimbrite fields all over the place, and you have in the back arc small mafic centers. That's sort of the magmatic diversity we're talking about. Here's a map. First of all, for orientation, we have these 3 zones of magmatism, of volcanism in the Andes, the northern volcanic zone and the southern, but we're looking at the central volcanic zone. And here's the triple junction between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, so you can always orient yourself with that feature. And along the arc, these are the distribution of active volcanoes. These gray areas, they're not gray, these sort of brownish areas are the distribution of ignimbrites. So if I made a map of Berlin, which is about 50 kilometers in diameter, you could see that the entire Berlin would fit sort of in here. And I should probably do a map of Brandenburg or one of these places that you know well. This covers a huge area, is the point. Covers a gigantic area, and these red symbols are the back arc mafic centers. During the course of this research we're talking about today, there were 2 case studies done. Each one of them was a PhD study. One of them in the ignimbrite area, in a volcanic complex called La Pacana, and one in this back arc region near Salar de Antofalla on the mafic centers. And we'll see some information from those. This map is chosen to show you something about the distribution of these two main types of volcanoes, namely volcanic features, namely the arc volcanoes. These are the blue circles. First, you can see how many there are. And secondly, the caldera complexes in red. And there's the names of them there, but the point of this slide is not the name, it's the ages. If you just look through this very, very briefly, you'll notice that everything is coming in between sort of 9 million years and 4 million years. This is what people in the volcanological community kind of like to call a flare-up. Like when you turn on a gas burner and it flares up. Yeah? So this is the ignimbrite flare-up this time. These are the sort of distributions of these gigantic caldera complexes, mostly in the northern area, as you see, not much in the south. And this is the point I made earlier, that the distribution of arc volcanoes is constricted to the Cordillera, usually at the border between Chile and Argentina. That's the highest place. But you'll notice that there's these circles in the back arc as well, and they tend to fall along these major lineament zones. Okay? The final point for the slide is the volumes. If you add up the volume of all of the arc magmatism, the stratovolcanoes, the back arc things don't even count there, but you can add them up too. If you add up all of this blue material, you come up, and you take into account the size of the area, you come up with a flux or a production of magma, something like 3 cubic kilometers every million years per kilometer of arc. This is kind of a figure, if you go into the basic geology textbooks, these sorts of figures you'll see them, they're about the productivity of magmatic systems, the productivity of the mid-ocean ridges, the productivity of volcanic arcs. This is the productivity of the central volcanic zone, roughly. But look at the difference between that and the red ignimbrites during the flare-up period. So there's about 10 times as much flux of magma erupting at the surface associated with these ignimbrites as there is for the entire number of arc volcanoes. What do the individual eruptions look like? Well, we don't see them happening, fortunately, but you can see that the volume of this area called the Altiplano Puna volcanic complex, this is about 15,000 cubic kilometers of material. Humans don't really know what that means. What does 15,000 cubic kilometers mean? Think about Mount St. Helens. That was a fairly dramatic eruption for people living nearby. It was about 1 kilometer, one cubic kilometer. And Pinatubo, another quite prominent recent ignimbritic eruption was also just 5. In the Altiplano Puna complex in the northern Andes, individual flow units can be 1,000 cubic kilometers in size. So these are what in the literature again tend to be called supervolcanoes. These are the really global killers. 1,000 cubic kilometers in a single flow unit, 1,000 times the volume that Mount St. Helens produced. The study of La Pacana caldera, this is a satellite image. This is a 30-kilometer diameter of the caldera. This was the work of a PhD student in the SFB, Jan Lindsay. She's now in New Zealand. And she basically put together this map of the volcanic units, and then we worked on the chemistry of the units, tried to understand how they form, what the ages are, how it all fits together. And Jan, well, here's a stratigraphic column, first of all. Associated with that caldera are 2 main units. This one, called the Etana, is the larger one. It's dacitic, so it has a silica content of about 65, 68 weight percent. Would be a granodiorite if it was a plutonic rock. And the one below it, the Tokonau rhyolite, is a high silica rock, 75% SiO2. It would be a granite if it was a plutonic rock, so a granodiorite and a granite, dacite rhyolite. And the dacite is sitting on top of the rhyolite. And the question comes up, how do those 2 magma units relate to each other? Are they separate? Are they completely separate? And the caldera was filled with magma twice, different compositions? Or is it the same system and one unit evolved by fractionation of the other? I could go into the geochemistry of these things for an hour, but we're just going to show one diagram out of many that Jan published. This one up here, where you see that the Etana, don't worry too much about the variables, but this is zirconium on the bottom, and barium, and this is rubidium and strontium. In terms of those variables and many other ones, these rocks look very different from one another. The green and the red are completely separate on these diagrams, and one would say, oh, well, that's different. Different compositions, different magmas have nothing to do with each other. Till it turns out that when you look at the isotopic compositions, we'll see those later, they're identical and the ages are very similar as well. And geologically, it comes from the same caldera. So there is some relationship to be looked for. And the key to finding the relationship are these inclusions of melt droplets inside the Etana pumice. These show that even though the bulk rock has this kind of a composition, the melt trapped in it, which is the more evolved composition, it's sprouting right along with the Tokonau pumices. You can see those dark triangles are right in the Tokonau field, same way here. This is the Etana pumice, but these are these late melts trapped in quartz. And this is a fractional crystallization model showing that you can go along here with subtraction of plagioclase and hornblende, biotite, crystals that you see in the magma, and you can produce this Tokonau composition by fractionating the Etana magma. So that the idea would be we're looking at a zoned magma chamber, one composition, but it's stratified internally. And the next question would be, okay, if it's one magma which is differentiated in this chamber, where is the chamber located? What are the temperatures and what are the pressures of these rocks? Here you can see 3 groups of temperature estimates. One for the Tokonau rhyolite, this more evolved rock, and then 2 different compositions from the Etana. More or less the same range of temperatures here. So it looks like a pretty similar temperature range in this chamber, and then we have some pressure estimates here from various methods. And what all that comes together, oh, I'm sorry, I should have pointed this out earlier. This is just a simple photo micrograph show of the Etana pumice showing these hornblendes and biotites and plagioclases, opaque phases. This is the glass here, the fiamme of the tuff. This is the pumice. And And using the composition of those minerals is how we come up with these estimates of temperature and pressure. So the sort of cartoon model of this system is a magma chamber at about 8 kilometers below the surface. Inside the magma chamber, we have a stratification. The more mafic, the heavier material is at the bottom, and the frothy, lighter rhyolite is at the top. These are some of the physical parameters of the magma that are calculated from the temperatures and the pressures and the composition. So there's density, there's a viscosity estimate there. These estimates can be used to talk about eruption style, height of the eruption column, these kinds of things that volcanologists like to worry about. But the message is, and you can see it here, that when you empty this chamber, the first thing that comes out is the rhyolite, so that forms this tokonao at the base, and then you start to empty the main chamber of less evolved material, and you get the less evolved material on top of the more evolved material, exactly the opposite of what is in the crust. You just have to, but it's quite logical that this is going to come out first, and then it's going to be followed with that. And that also fits with the ages. This is the older eruption, and it's followed by that one. Let's get into the question about where these magmas are coming from. With this diagram, this is showing the isotopic composition of quite a lot of different rocks. First, and we don't have to know too much about isotope geochemistry to understand the diagram. These are ratios of two isotopes of strontium and neodymium. That one is in shorthand. It's the ratio of two isotopes as well, but we normalize it to a value. So it's given this epsilon notation. The message for us is that the mantle plots somewhere up here. Okay, and if you look at more compositions, they would also be up here somewhere. So this is what the mantle produces. These would be the basalts. This is the composition of the local crust. These are the granites in the Paleozoic basement. Gneisses in the basement would plot over here. So you have these two sort of, let's say, end members, crust and mantle. And the small circles that you see here represent a set of data from the stratovolcanoes in the arc. And they sort of show a kind of mixing between those two components. The large ignimbrites in these, here's Pakana here, which is Atana and Tokonao, and then there's other ones. These large ignimbrites plot here, quite close to the crustal field, but still with considerable contribution of arc. And I didn't mention it, but it's interesting to notice that there's also ignimbrites. They look quite similar, but they have the same composition as the arc does. And what these rocks are, these are just simple differentiation of the volcano. So these stratovolcanoes can also produce ashes. They can also erupt like Mount St. Helens does. In fact, Mount St. Helens would plot somewhere near here because it's quite a primitive magma. Whereas these big things don't look like that at all. They look much more like the crust, and they have much larger volumes. The thing that's starting to sort of gel as a hypothesis is that the melts here are coming from the crust, and they're getting these large volumes because the crust itself is melting and not just the mantle in the subduction zone. It's possible to estimate the contribution of those two end members, the basaltic end member and the granite end member, with various mixing calculations. These are just showing you two curves that we generated to try to estimate how much of the crust and how much of this end member are in the ignimbrites. It depends on how you treat these curves and the assumptions you make in the modeling. But you come up to something on the order of either between half and half, or in this case, more like dominant 70% crust, 30% andesite. Some people would say half and half. We think it's a little bit different. But even if it is half and half, that's saying that you're adding 50% material to what the arc normally produces by melting the crust. Another argument for crust in these ignimbrites is shown here. This diagram, this histogram, shows a model age, which is a way of describing the time at which material now in a magma, granites, ignimbrites, the time at which that was extracted from the mantle. And the time at which this material is extracted from the mantle, you can see, is about 1.5, 2 billion years ago. In the red diagrams, in the red rocks, in the red symbols, you're looking at Paleozoic basement. In the blue symbol as well. But notice that the ignimbrites from the Cenozoic have the same distribution of model ages as these basement rocks. Now that's telling us that the magmas in the ignimbrites, which are young, those magmas have material from the old crust in them. And to prove that point even more dramatically, these are zircons, 2 zircon populations in the ignimbrites. You may not see it so well, but there's an ellipse here. These were dated by ion probe, and the dates of these spots on that zircon crystal are the same age as the ignimbrite, 4 million years. But this crystal of zircon from the ignimbrite is closer to 600 million years old. This is an inherited crustal zircon ripped up from the source of the melting, which is also giving this isotopic signature. So we have very clear evidence that these ignimbrite magmas are partly crustal material which has melted. And again, depending on your personal preference for how to model these things, assumptions about the end-member compositions, it looks like 50-50 or 70-30 mix. In any case, a lot of crust. So that's one message. Now that we don't stop there, because we'd like to know exactly where this crust melting is going on. Is it at the base of the crust? Is it at the moho? Is it somewhere in the middle? And how much melt is produced? Now, this may be getting ahead of the game a little bit, but I've played with this. These experimental data show us if you melt a normal biotite gneiss, which is what the Andean crust, let's say, in large extent looks like, the pre-Andean crust, the basement. A metamorphic rock with quartz plagioclase and some biotite. There's 2 experiments shown here. And what they show you is that for 1 mole of biotite, you get almost 2 moles of melt. So that's one message. They also tell you that at high pressure and low pressure, you have 2 different minerals forming in addition to the melt. And the reason I put this one in blue is because garnet, if it forms during this melting reaction, this garnet has a geochemical fingerprint that we can detect in the rock. The reason is garnet has a love of heavy rare earth elements. If garnet forms, all the heavy rare earth elements in the magma will be sucked up and eaten by the garnet and kept there, and the melt will have a depletion. It will show have low concentrations of those elements because the garnet is including them in it. So this garnet signature can be seen, and I'll show you that in the next slide, in the rock. And it's one of the things that petrologists look for, because if you see it or if you don't see it, it tells you something about the pressure at which the melting is taking place. Okay? The other point here comes from this stoichiometry. And it tells us that if you take an average rock that has something like 10% biotite in it, the most melt that you can produce is going to be about 2 times that amount. So you might keep in mind that you could maybe produce 20% melt even if before you exhaust all of the mica or hornblende in the rock. Here's the garnet thing again. These are 2 rare earth elements. Some of us geochemical specialists say, oh yeah, klar. Others would say, huh? What do you mean? What are those elements? Turns out that we talked about the heavy rare earth elements. Ytterbium is one of those. And the light rare earth elements, lanthanum is one of those. So the ratio between those 2 elements is telling us something about the light versus the heavy rare earth element, let's say, budget contents in a rock. And here is what the average basement looks like in terms of this ratio. It looks something like this, right? I don't know what that is. It's about 12, 15. This is the composition of these ignimbrites. Not so far away from the basement, a little bit above it. And these curves show us how this ratio change as you melt the crust. And you can see that if you melt it just a little bit, this is 100% melt, this is 0. So this is 50% of the rock is melted. If you just melt it between, let's say, 10%, 20%, in the previous slide we saw that 20% was about all you can get out of it because it only has 10% biotite in it. You might get a melt degree of 20%, but if you did, you would have this kind of a high ratio. That's what these curves are telling us. This ratio of lanthanum to terbium changes with the degree of melting if you're melting this source along those curves. And it means that if we take that source as the crustal melt, and we have observed this ratio in the pumice, in the ignimbrites, we would need to melt the source by 50% in order to meet that composition. Otherwise, we have very high ratios of these elements. We know that we can't melt it by 50%. You can't just melt the crust by 50% unless you have a huge amount of water or hydrous minerals. So 20 is probably more or less the limit. And what that's telling us is that we should see these kinds of elevated ratios in our rock, and we don't see it. What does that mean? It means that we're not in the garnet stability field. We're not forming garnet. If we did form garnet, we would be up here somewhere. And getting back to this other experimental study here, we can conclude that the absence of a garnet signature is telling us that this melting of the crust is taking place at a rather low pressure, rather high, low depth, low pressure. So to sum up this work on the ignimbrites, these are huge eruptions. They're from shallow magma chambers, and the magma source is significantly crustal. We can say a little bit more about it, and we can say that we don't have the garnet signature, and we think that we're not in the lower crust. We know that we're somewhere above the lower crust. Oops, going the wrong way. That's the message from petrology geochemistry. We have these ideas about where melt is being generated and how it's being mixed. And now I'm going to switch gears for a moment and talk about the geophysics in this area, because the geophysics in this area has also shown evidence that there is partial melting in the crust below this area today, not just at 4 million years during the flare-up. There's 5 different sets of data, types of data that all coincide with this picture. And what we're going to look at is what is the extent of this zone, this partial melting zone? What's the depth? And how much melt is in it? And then we could try to compare those constraints, those features, with what we think we see in the rock record. So this diagram now, it's the map we had earlier. There's the arc volcanoes and the caldera complexes. Here's the ages and the names of the calderas. We had that earlier. Superimposed on that is a pink blob and some diamonds. The diamonds are seismic stations where people have gone out in the field during this SFB study and put down seismometers and measured the earthquake waves that they receive. So this is a passive seismic experiment. They just put a receiver down and wait till enough earthquakes happen that the seismometer can register the travel times, the arrival times from distant earthquakes. So that's the seismic array. And the stations that are blue have, let's say, normal crust underneath them. And the stations that are colored in red have detected this magma body. They detected it because when the seismic waves go through a partially melted rock, they slow down. In fact, the S wave gets completely dampened and can't go through if it's a liquid. So you find this zone underneath these stations where there's something funny going on with the seismic transmission. And this pink blob is outlining the main distribution of those stations. And the main distribution of those stations, where you have this evidence for partial melting, is coinciding more or less with the area of the strongest caldera complex concentration and the strongest concentration of ignimbrites. So the rock record tells us something major happened at 4 million years ago, between 10 to 4 million years ago, this flare-up. And the geophysics record is telling us that it's still there now. So it could erupt again, is the message, I guess. These are two images from cross-sections. This top one is one of the main evidences for crustal melting was that the crust has a low resistivity or a high conductivity, electrical conductivity. The melts conduct electricity very well. Magma of basaltic composition has a similar electrical conductivity as seawater if it's at high temperature. So it's a very conductive material. And where you have low resistivity, high conductivity is where you may hypothesize crustal melting. This diagram here is the seismic velocity of the S wave at 3 to 4 different stations, however many stations that is. And you can see again, and this is depth, surface, and the MOHO is down here. You can see this pink zone here is where the S wave velocity goes down and takes a dive. So this is showing us that the S wave at that level and the conductivity at that level, around 20 kilometers depth, is showing us that there's something going on. Finally, there was a study done on experimental study done in the laboratory, trying to understand how much melting is in the crust, how much melt is contained in the crust, in order to produce this conductivity anomaly. And what you see here is the percentage of melt from 0 to 100. And here is the conductivity in sieverts per meter. It's a unit of conductivity. This value of 1 is what is observed in the high conductivity red blob I showed you earlier. And these curves show you what the conductivity of a partly melted rock looks like and is a function of the amount of melt in it. So these are really done in laboratory experiments. You take a rock, they melt it, they measure conductivity in situ, and you can see that if you follow these curves, you come up with they intersect the observed conductivity somewhere in the range of 15 to 25% melt. Meaning for us, it looks like that material here is as conductive as it is because it contains something on the order of 20% melt. The other message that you have to have, that you take away here, is that this melt, in order to conduct electricity, of course, the melt has to be connected. You can't just have isolated pockets and blobs of melt in the rock. You won't conduct electricity. So here's the curve showing for insulated pockets of melt. And in order to get to where we need to be, you would have to essentially just melt the entire rock. So it's number one, the message is these melts are connected. And number two, it's probably about 20%. You remember that the 20% also came out of this sort of back of the envelope description, estimate. If I have a biotite bearing rock with about 10% biotite, I might get 20% melt out of it. So what does it all come together? As a geologist, we see these kinds of things in the field. And there is a migmatite. There's the distribution of what was a partially melted fraction. It's connected through this body of rock. It's, you can estimate the modal amount of these leucosomes if you care to do it. It varies from one migmatite to another. But I think 20% is not an unrealistic value. So what we think that this Altiplano Puna melted zone is simply a live, living migmatite zone. It's what you see in the Schwarzwald. It's what you see in a lot of basement outcrops all over the world. This is a high-grade metamorphic feature, partial melting. And in the Andes, it's happening at something like 20, 30 kilometers depth. The final point I want to mention is the efforts of modelers in the group. And we have lots of modelers in the strategy group as well. These people are very useful because they take observations and hypotheses that we develop. They must be melting at 30 kilometers depth, must be 800 degrees. They take these kinds of observations and they put them into a physical framework and test whether the scenario makes any sense or not. So what the modelers did with this partial melting zone in the Andes was to try to find ways to explain the formation of this large body of partly melted rock, the timing of the ignimbrite flare-up, the timing when it started. We know that from the rock record. It started at about 10 million years ago. The flare-up was from 10 to 4, more or less. We know when the shortening of the Andes started, that was more or less at about 30, 40 million years ago. So there was 10, 20 million years sort of incubation before this flare-up happened. And we know what the temperature is because we have the composition of the ignimbrites, and we know they're about 750, 800 degrees hot. And we know at what depth this is taking place because we have the geophysical evidence that it's at about 20, 25 kilometers. So the modelers have taken the effort to try to reproduce those temperatures at that depth using different sources of heat. One source of heat is just the crustal heat source itself. The crust, it has uranium and thorium, it generates heat, internal heating, or during the deformation of the Andes, you could imagine there might be some frictional heat going on as well, a contribution from deformation. Those are the internal sources. There's the arc, obviously. There's a lot of heat going on in the arc. The modeling of that was to just take the average productivity and see what the effect, the thermal effect is of intruding this amount of magma at that temperature within a 5 kilometer thick layer and see how the heat buildup, temperature buildup develops. And the third source of heat is the mantle itself. So we'll look at those things in a minute. What we know from geology is that we have to have 800 degrees Celsius at about 20 kilometers depth. This is where this partially melted zone seems to be. And we know that it has to develop within a certain amount of time after the shortening starts. We also know the crustal thickness of the pre-Andean crust, around 35, 40 kilometers. And we give it a standard geothermal gradient. Squeeze it for 30 million years, shorten it, thicken it, and add these different sources of heat that we talked about a minute ago. So a constant shortening rate, 100% within 30 million years, initial crustal rheology and mantle rheology, and a certain dimension to our section, which is based on how big this anomaly is in diameter. And this is basically the result in simple terms. Here's the temperature, and here's the time. So we started with and we're looking at 20 to 25 kilometers depth. So we started with this geothermal gradient of 25 degrees per kilometer, and we get about 500 degrees at 25 kilometers depth. This is the starting condition, and then the system gets squeezed, and we have different sources of heating, the internal heat sources, the internal heat plus adding what the arc produces, and then we have the effect of a third heat source coming from the mantle below with two different ways of conducting the heat or transporting the heat upwards. One is just pure conduction, and the other one is to actually convect heat by moving mass around, okay? This is our target temperature, 800 degrees. And yeah, like I said, this is the time involved. So basically, putting it in these simple terms, if these are our choices of heat sources that would produce the anomaly that we see, in the time we require, which is around here, it looks like we have to have a hot mantle addition, and we have to have this heat transported by convection and not just by conduction. That's the message of that diagram. This is a snapshot of one of these numerical models, the one with the hot mantle convection at 3 different times after the process starts. And you can see that the 35, 40 kilometer crust is getting a little bit thicker here. What's happening here is that you're having these, during the deformation, and because it's a weak crust, it's forming ductilely, and the heat is transported by this ductile doming of hot, partially melted, perhaps material, coming from this heat source at the base. And we're looking, remember, we're looking at 20 kilometers depth, so this was basically this last diagram. We're looking at this red curve. By the time you get the process going, 10, 15 million years after the start of shortening, when you get this convection building up, we're looking at this level here at 20, 30 kilometers depth, and we're getting these temperatures of 800 something degrees that were shown on the curves below. Okay? So the message from modeling then is, the message for modeling then is that yes, you can establish this zone that we think we have to have, only if you have a high input of heat from the mantle. The arc by itself doesn't do anything. It's just not an efficient way of heating the bulk crust. It's producing volcanoes, but there's not that much heat transfer into the crust from those conduits. But if you heat the base of this whole area from the mantle, and you introduce the deformation of shortening, you do get these domes coming up. Again, in geology, you will hear the word gneiss domes. And if you are a sort of crustal geologist like Uwe is, you will know that there's examples in the deeply eroded crust where you see these kinds of structures of ductile deformation in a dome form, of in the middle lower crust, seeing these sorts of convective transport of material. You see that in the rock record. So that seems like possibly something that's happening here. A migmatite zone, a gneiss dome, driven by the combination of high heat at the base of the crust and active deformation. So we need high heat in the mantle, and the last part of this large project was to look at what the mantle actually shows. Seismically, obviously, because we don't have any rocks from the mantle except for a few xenoliths. In these two pictures, and again, this is a map view. Here's the triple junction between Bolivia and Chile and Argentina. This is our area here. In map view, this is the distribution of seismic velocities below the Moho at 85 kilometers depth. And it's in kilometers per second. No, actually, I think it's not. I think it's in the deviation from normal, okay? That sounds a little silly, but what I mean is the light color, the 0, is what the sort of normal global mantle S wave and P wave velocity is. And where you have these dark colors, that means the mantle is faster, it's higher velocities. It's higher velocities here because the slab is subducting and cooling the mantle. And it's lower velocities here because there's more heat being produced in input. There's also heat being input along the arc. You can sort of guess that here. These are the arc volcanoes, and the seismic velocity of the upper mantle here is a bit higher than normal. This is the cold slab effect. And then in the back arc, the area that we're interested in here with these ignimbrites, you see a very large anomaly of slow mantle, which can be rationalized as high temperature. If you take that diagram we showed in the previous one, and you invert the seismic wave velocity for temperature, to do that you assume that the mantle has just one composition, and the only variable affecting the S-wave velocity is temperature. So that's an assumption. It's possible that the mantle here is not homogeneous in composition, but if it is, you can turn the S-wave velocity directly into a temperature estimate. And if you do that, and you map that into this cross-section, you see, and this is temperature now at the base, you can see that the anomaly we saw in this previous diagram at 85 kilometers depth, I'm sorry, I chopped off the depth here. So MOHO is at about 60. So 85 would be something in here. You can see that there's this heterogeneous distribution of temperature in the mantle. And with the interesting feature in this part of the diagram that you have hot mantle above colder mantle. Right? Hot above cold. So it's this hot above cold anomaly that people suggest is showing us that there's a delamination of lithosphere happening. In other words, normally this would all be purple all across here. You would have a cooler upper mantle and a hotter lower mantle. But in this particular part of the system, this cooler upper mantle is dropping off, and the hotter lower mantle is coming up into the gap. That is the source of heat at the MOHO that we need for producing the convection and producing the melting in the middle of the crust and producing the ignimbrite flare-up that we saw. And maybe this is the last diagram. This is a model again. This is a geodynamic model where the people have tried to test the idea that something like that would actually happen. In order to delaminate something, you have to have a density contrast, right? So this material actually has to be denser than this material, otherwise it won't go down. And number two, this material below has to have a low enough viscosity so that you can do that. If it's very stiff, you can have a density contrast, but it will just be supported by the stiff lower unit. So by putting these kinds of density, viscosity, temperature variables into this kind of a geodynamic model, Stefan Sobolev and Andrei Babenko, those are the two people who did this work, they were able to show that in fact there would be, under certain conditions, a low viscosity here, a density contrast here, and the tendency for this material to sink. So the idea of delamination is suggested by geology, really. It's suggested by a lot of geophysical, it's suggested by geology, it's supported by a lot of geophysical observations, and it's, let's say, tested in a positive way with these kinds of dynamic models. So, to wrap it all up, we see this geologic, unique ignimbrite flare-up. We know what the ages and compositions, temperatures, and chamber depths are. We see these geophysical anomalies. They're consistent with each other. Same order of magnitude, degree of melting, same distribution aerially. And they're probably expressions of this live ligmatite zone as I described it. A zone in the middle crust where you have possibly 20% partial melt and 80% solid rock. One point for you is that obviously if you have this zone in the middle crust, any magmas that are trying to come through it will get stuck because it's weak. And if you're an arc andesite trying to make your way to the surface to erupt as a basalt, or as a back arc basalt, you'll encounter this zone of melting, which is like a sponge, and you will be trapped there and adding to it. So it's like I think that's why it's still there, is because it's being fed by trapping these arc and back arc melts. The crustal melting on a large scale doesn't happen at most normal arcs, and you don't see these large ignimbrite provinces all over the world. Starting and maintaining the zone requires this high mantle input of heat, and it also seems to require convection in the crust, which is produced by the deformation of the Andes, a shortening. And it looks like, so far at least, there's not an alternative geodynamic explanation for this high heat at that time. It looks like this idea of lithospheric delamination during the Andean shortening is what causes the upwelling of hot asthenosphere and sets the whole system moving. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, so thank you.